Okay, looks like we're rolling. Folks, hello and welcome to the Centre for Constitutional Studies for our 33rd annual McDonald Lecture. My name is Dr. Richard Mailey, and I'm the director of the Centre. And it's a real pleasure to be here today to introduce this year's McDonald lecturer, Jakob Mchangama, who's the executive director for Justitia, a judicial think tank located in Copenhagen. So I'll be throwing over to the chair of the Centre's board to introduce Jakob shortly. But before I do, I'd like to begin today's proceedings by acknowledging the land that I'm speaking from today, which is Treaty 6 territory in Edmonton. And we, the Centre and I, accordingly acknowledge and honour the ancestors, traditions and spirit that first drew Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Saulteaux and Inuit to this unique gathering place. And in acknowledging the territory that we're on, we also acknowledge that all of us here are beneficiaries of treaty. And we call upon the spirit and intent of treaty to maintain us in a stronger, more enduring, more equal relationship. And of course, it goes without saying as well that this thing that I'm doing, this land acknowledgement, is only one exceptionally small step in the ongoing process of fostering that stronger, more enduring relationship. Now, this lecture that you're all here for today is endowed to the Faculty of Law at the U of A by the family of the late Justice David C. McDonald of the Alberta Court of Queen's Bench. And it's with a sense of the utmost gratitude to them and their generosity that I'd like to say a few words first about Justice McDonald. So Justice McDonald was, like many a great Albertan, born in Saskatchewan. And his journey to the bench began with an arts degree at the U of A, followed by a stint studying law at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. And while Justice McDonald never actually studied law at the U of A, he was a dedicated, consistent friend of the university and the law faculty in particular. And indeed, he taught here for many years, initially as a faculty member, and then as a sessional lecturer while he was in private practice in Edmonton. And as a testament to how much he gave to the law faculty and how much the faculty appreciate his work, it's worth mentioning that Justice McDonald is represented on our Wall of Honour as one of the builders of the faculty here at the U of A. So we're here today to honour his memory and out of deep gratitude for his lifelong commitment to this place and the work that it does. So a huge thank you to Justice McDonald and to his family. Now, that's the first important reason that we're here today, but there is a second one, and that's to hear from our distinguished guest, Jakob Mchangama. And like I said before, I'm going to hand over to the chair of our Centre's board in a few moments to introduce Jakob. But just before I do, I should let you know that we will be taking questions after the lecture. So if you think of a question during or after the lecture, please post it in the Q&A section of Zoom and I'll relay it to Jakob. So with that said, it's my distinct pleasure to hand over the virtual mic to Professor Stephen Penny, the chair of the Centre for Constitutional Studies Advisory Board and full professor here at the Faculty of Law. So Stephen, take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. It's my very, very great pleasure to introduce our 2022 McDonald lecturer, Jakob Mchangama. And Jakob is, as mentioned, the director of Justitia, a judicial think tank based in Copenhagen that works to promote the rule of law and human rights, both in Denmark and around the world. And he's written and commented extensively on free speech and human rights in international media outlets, including some you may have heard of, like The Economist, Washington Post, BBC, CBS News, NPR, CNN, Wall Street Journal, and others. He's also published in peer-reviewed academic journals. And he's the producer and narrator of the podcast, Clear and Present Danger, A History of Free Speech. Now, I first encountered Jakob earlier this year when he appeared on a podcast that I regularly listen to discuss his magisterial new book, Free Speech, A Global History from Socrates to Social Media. And on the strength of that appearance, where he was extremely eloquent and persuasive, I went out and bought the book, which I guess is the whole point of doing a book tour in some respects. So it worked on me anyway. And the book is, I have to say, a rigorous, but also highly engaging and accessible account of the history of censorship and those who have struggled against it. And the key insight of the book, at least to me, is that from ancient Athens really up until the present day, the cultural, legal, and political conditions necessary for freedom of speech to flourish are really quite extraordinarily rare and precious, especially in the context of what Jakob calls egalitarian free speech. That is the ability of ordinary people to express views that may be disfavored by elites or members of the ruling class. So I'm very much forward to hearing Jakob elaborate on this thesis and related issues in the context of his talks today, which is entitled The Free Speech Recession and How to End It. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Jakob.
Thank you so much, Steve, for that introduction, and thank you for getting the book. Very much appreciated. It's a pleasure and a privilege to provided the opportunity to give this lecture. So thank you very much. I've been looking forward to it. As you might have gathered from my bio, free speech is a topic that I've engaged with almost obsessively for a very long time. And the way I came about to think about it was, well, let me start somewhere else. I grew up in Denmark, which in many ways, like Canada, is a liberal, secular, open democracy. And for a very long time, in my youth, I never really thought about free speech. I took it for granted. It was like breathing the air, and free speech was never really put to the test. But as some of you might remember, a Danish newspaper in 2005 chose to publish a number of cartoons depicting the Muslim prophet Muhammad. And that led to a global battle of values over the relationship between free speech and religion. And it's forced a lot of people to think about free speech. You know, is it what does this value mean? Is it as important as some have said? And what intrigued me was that a lot of those who saw themselves as living and breathing Enlightenment values, secular values, suddenly had second thoughts about free speech. They thought that the cartoons were an attempt at punching down on a marginalized minority, i.e. Danish Muslims who had been subject to an often very, very vigorous public debate in Denmark, and had sometimes also been vilified by political parties and others. But what I saw then was that people on the right tended to be free speech absolutists during the cartoon affair. But then we had a center-right government come into power that adopted various laws that were targeted really at limiting the religious free speech of Muslims, of imams and others. And then suddenly the position shifted. People on the left, and I'm generalizing here, were suddenly against this. They saw it as an encroachment of free speech, whereas people on the right saw it as necessary to safeguard free speech. And that dynamic really has intrigued me over the years. And I thought that exploring the history of free speech might be a good way to examine if, how, and why free speech really matters in democracies and outside democracy. Where does this principle come from? Why does it matter? And under what conditions can it flourish? And you might see the title of my lecture today, The Free Speech Recession and How to Reverse It, and say, why is he talking about a free speech recession? You know, here he is sitting in Copenhagen and communicating without censorship with people around the world, 8 time zones away, and people all over the world are doing the same thing right now. So in many ways, we have better means of communicating and accessing information across the globe than than previous generations could ever have dreamt about. And it is true, you could say that if you look at the current state of free speech, we're still living in a sort of golden age. But I would argue that that golden age is in retreat, and that we have entered a free speech recession. And why do I say that? Well, let's talk about the golden age first. From around the 70s and up until the early 2000s, there was a wave of democratization, a third wave of democratization that went hand in hand with free speech. So if you look at the collapse of communism, for instance, free speech was a vital instrument for many dissidents that lived in communist states, a vital means of undermining communist rule. When it comes to apartheid in South Africa, again, opponents of apartheid rule were absolutely relying on international media, human rights organizations, and so on to shine a light on the gross injustices of apartheid, whereas the apartheid regime took censorship to extreme measures. And then, of course, in the 1990s, we saw the internet really coming to life. And I'll read to you the Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace coined by John Perry Barlow in 1996, which really, I think, really captures the spirit of the early internet and sort of the optimism about free speech and technology that reigned at the time. Now, John Perry Barlow wrote, "We're creating a world where anyone, anywhere may express his or her beliefs, no matter how singular, without fear of being coerced into silence or conformity. Your legal concepts of property, expression, identity, movement, and context do not apply to us. They are all based on matter, and there is no matter here." So what John Perry Barlow expressed was this early Silicon Valley techno-optimism, some would say techno-utopianism, where the internet would supercharge a radically decentralized manner of speaking, where anyone, anywhere could speak to anyone, anywhere, without any censorship, whether corporate or state. Now, this optimism carried on into the first decade of the 2000s. So in 2006, a young first-time senator from Illinois called Barack Obama had a blog, remember those? And where he released podcasts. And in one of them, he said that the internet today is an open platform where the demand for websites and services dictates success. And he says, it's because the internet is a neutral platform that I can say what I want without censorship. So at the time in 2006, Barack Obama, as an outsider, an African American who was not part of the Democratic establishment, used the internet to great effect. He connected with young voters, and he won, when he ran for president, he won the so-called Facebook generation, and he won it twice, really, which sort of epitomized the way that the internet free speech was seen as part and parcel of progressive, democratic, liberal values. But what happened was that the internet became more centralized. It moved away from this radically egalitarian, decentralized model. So in every minute of 2021, 4 million YouTube videos were streamed, 500,000 tweets were shut off, and 500,000 comments were posted to Facebook every minute. And this meant that suddenly everyone, in principle at least, had a voice, and that provided certainly a voice to many minorities, groups that hadn't been able to speak out in public before. But it also provided a voice to extremists. It also it provided a voice to conspiracy theorists. It provided a voice to those who were against democracy. It provided a voice to misogynist trolls, racists, anti-Semites, and others. And whereas we had originally believed that the internet and the digital age would render censorship obsolete, authoritarian states learned how to reverse engineer the internet and turn its original promise on its head and really create digital juggernauts of massive digital surveillance and censorship, with China leading the charge. So right now we're actually in a state in the world where in 2021 there was a record of journalists imprisoned when you measure back from 2000. In 2000 there were 92. In 2021 there were 293. So a massive growth. And we've also seen for more than a decade that internet freedom is in decline. Now, of course, the fact that free speech is in decline around the globe should not surprise us when it comes to authoritarian states, since the first overthrow of democracy in ancient Athens, the page one in the dictator's playbook has been to subvert free speech, to try and control what can be said so as not to let public opinion be free and undermine the absolute rule of a dictator or a party or a whatever source of power wants to control all power. But what we see also happening is that democracies are increasingly contributing to the free speech recession. So it's not only authoritarian states that it's not only in Russia, for instance, where you can go to prison for 15 years if you call the invasion of Ukraine a war. It is not only in Saudi Arabia where you can get lashed or even the death penalty if you blaspheme against Islam. It's actually democracies, open liberal democracies, who on the one hand still see and articulate free speech as a fundamental value, but have come increasingly in the digital age to see free speech as much as a threat than as a guarantee for democratic values, the very democratic system, and also values of tolerance, equality, and dignity, especially of minorities. And I think the real game changer, the institutional in institutional attitudes, was the 2016 US presidential election, in which Donald Trump, a bit like Obama, if we have to be honest, was very, very efficient at using social media, at energizing voters that were fed up with the status quo. But very quickly, the narrative became that Donald Trump had won the US presidential election due to false information, and that had been the decisive element, and therefore these social media platforms that had really been praised, especially with the Arab Spring, as being the harbingers of the ever-expanding wave of democracy and freedom, were suddenly now seen as corrosive to democracy, as undermining it, as spreading poison into the ores of democracy. And as a result of that, more and more democracies have adopted laws trying to crack down on and impose some kind of top-down control on what can be said and spread through global platforms. One of the pioneering efforts was the German Network Enforcement Act from 2017, a German law which said that if platforms that have at least 2 million users don't remove manifestly illegal content within 24 hours, they risk fines of up to 50 million euros. The European Union has recently adopted the so-called Digital Services Act, which the EU views as a gold standard for regulation of social media or the internet around the world. I know that in Canada you've had controversies over false information in election campaigns. I believe there was a judicial decision striking down a law. And I believe there have also been various discussions and bills that at least discussed about imposing various restrictions on speech thought to threaten basic values in Canadian democracy. Hate speech is, of course, another big issue. So the European Union is also trying to harmonize the concept of hate speech, and more European countries are expanding existing hate speech bans around the world to include more and more categories, and seeking to sort of mute the most extreme voices that seek to fan hatred and against minorities and so on. So, and of course, we should acknowledge that free speech does come with harms, and the internet can facilitate harms. So the best, if you like, if I can use such a word, example of that is the January 6th attack on the Capitol in the United States. It would be very difficult to imagine the January 6th attack on the peaceful transfer of power in the world's largest democracy without conspiracy theories going viral on social media, spread by the president himself. So that means that some of these efforts reflect real concerns. However, they're also part of a very old pattern of what I would call elite panic. So you remember the quote I gave you before from Barack Obama in 2006, when he was very efficiently using free speech, online free speech, to make one of the greatest political careers in modern history. But in 2020, after the US presidential election, suddenly Barack Obama thought that online disinformation was the single biggest threat to our democracy. So that really showed epitomizes the institutional changes in attitudes when the former outsider who had used free speech to come into power suddenly saw those vehicles as a threat. But elite panic is hardly a modern phenomenon. It is not something that was born in the digital age out of concerns about the internet. It goes back all the way back to the birth of free speech. And Stephen, you mentioned the Athenian democracy and egalitarian free speech, and the conflict between egalitarian and elitist free speech is at the heart of elite panic. So I'm going to generalize now, but the Athenian model of free speech goes back to the direct democracy of the Athenians, in which all freeborn male citizens had a direct voice in political affairs, could debate and vote on the laws adopted in the ecclesia, in the assembly. But more generally and more broader, the Athenians also had a concept called parousia, meaning something like uninhibited speech, which was a culture that put a premium on the tolerance of social dissent, saw that as a virtue, and that also extended to all members, even foreigners. So someone like Aristotle, who was not an Athenian, could set up shop in Athens and criticize the very Athenian democracy that allowed him to philosophize. but you can contrast the Athenian model with the model of free speech in the Roman Republic. The Roman Republic had a much more top-down approach to free speech. So free speech was appreciated, but it was to be exercised by the elite, by the senatorial elite of well-educated, wealthy old men who did not appreciate the voice of the unwashed mob. So people like Cicero and Cato, these famous figures, were all about free speech, but not for the masses. In fact, they saw the downfall of Athens as being caused by allowing the riffraff into the assemblies and making decisions that should best have been left with the best and brightest and wealthiest. And this elite panic breaks out again and again when you see new technological changes in communications technology and or the public sphere is expanded into to previously marginalized groups. So let me give some examples. So some of you might be familiar with the great humanist scholar Erasmus of Rotterdam, who was a prodigious writer, wrote numerous tracts and books. But in 1525, he wrote that printers fill the world with pamphlets and books that are foolish, ignorant, malignant, libelous, mad, impious, and subversive. So books were seen by Erasmus as a threat that printing had gone too far. And of course, the background of that was the Reformation, when the ideas of Martin Luther was mixed in an explosive cocktail with print technology that made the Reformation go viral, and where Martin Luther, not unlike Donald Trump or other populists, really changed the way of communicating directly to the ordinary people rather than writing in terse, dry Latin and using cartoons, speaking in plain words. Something that the Catholic Church did not appreciate and which really eroded its authority. Now, let me make another jump to 1858 and an editorial in the New York Times writing about the invention of the transatlantic telegraph. And the New York Times writes in 1858, "So far as the influence of the newspaper upon the mind and morals of the people is concerned, there can be no rational doubt that the telegraph has caused vast injury. Superficial, sudden, unsifted, too fast for the truth must be all telegraphic intelligence." So once again, we see that a radical breakthrough in communication technology makes people uneasy, thinking that it is dangerous when news and information travels too fast and reaches new audiences, erodes the position of the established gatekeepers, and allows more ordinary people to get unfiltered information. And you could find similar examples when it comes to the radio and so on. So elite panic that we're living through right now is not something new. So even though there might be good reasons for thinking about what to do about the harms and costs of free speech in a digital age where extremism, conspiracy theories can be amplified and spread faster than any time before, it is good to be aware that this is not a new phenomenon. But I think there are also other good reasons to think about why, even when we're tempted to limit free speech with good intentions, in order to safeguard the values that we hold dear, to think twice. And one of the ways to do that is to look back and see what role free speech has played. And I would argue that free speech is the most important of human rights. And I think one of the most clarifying ways to look at it is to look at it at what role free speech has played for marginalized groups, minorities, and the oppressed. Because today, one of the main reasons why many liberal democracies want to limit free speech is this idea that free speech, especially in the digital age, entrenches unequal power relations. So is being used as a weapon, is being weaponized against vulnerable groups, minorities, and the marginalized. But I would argue that history shows a very different picture. And I think a very good example of this is Frederick Douglass, the famous American orator and abolitionist. Now, Frederick Douglass was born as a slave in Maryland, but escaped and became one of the most famous journalists and orators and abolitionists in the United States and indeed the world. And Frederick Douglass is adamant that free speech is completely incompatible with slavery, and he has this universalist view of free speech. So he says in 1860, a man's right to speak does not depend upon where he was born or upon his color. The simple quality of manhood is the solid basis of the right, and there let it rest forever. And we should contrast Frederick Douglass's universalist defense of free speech with the attitudes of slaveholding states. So even though the United States had adopted the First Amendment decades earlier, in southern states, in a number of southern states in the 1830s, laws were adopted that could put you in prison, or in some cases even apply the death penalty if you spread or disseminated abolitionist ideas. In fact, President Andrew Jackson proposed a federal law that would prohibit the Mail from spreading, disseminating abolitionist tracts to the South. And the reason why Frederick Douglass gave the speech that I quoted from was because in 1860, when he was speaking at an abolitionist meeting in Boston, it was broken up by well-to-do white Bostonians who thought that Frederick Douglass' abolitionist ideas were too radical and threatened the Union and their commercial interests. So that was really Frederick Douglass' reply to that. And Douglass also has another great quote that I really love. He says that the right of speech is a very precious one, especially to the oppressed. And I think Douglass's history resonates again and again through the ages. So you could take Mahatma Gandhi when he fought against British colonialism. So in 1921, he was tried for sedition by the British in India for having written a number of newspaper articles that criticized British colonialism and called for Indian independence. And Gandhi was sentenced to 6 years in prison by a British judge for his words. And Gandhi held a very, very famous trial speech in which he said that a man must be free to criticize any person or system as long as you don't incite violence. So this is actually pretty close to free speech absolutism on Gandhi's part. And this is at a time where, for instance, in the United States, you could go to jail for 10 or 20 years if you criticized American involvement in World War I. There had been a number of cases just a few years before Gandhi made those remarks. And really, free speech was seen as absolutely instrumental by Gandhi and many other Indian nationalists in the struggle to free themselves of British rule. If we go back to the United States, the civil rights movement is actually one of the reasons why the United States is seen as an outlier when it comes to the protection of free speech, as one that provides a very, very robust protection of free speech under the First Amendment to the Constitution. That has not been historically the case for most of the time since the First Amendment was ratified. It actually did not provide a very strong and robust protection, but the civil rights movement used free speech as a powerful weapon in the fight against white supremacy. And when John Lewis, the famous abolitionist, the famous civil rights leader and later congressman, looked back on the epic struggle that he'd been part of, at one time being arrested in Dallas for protesting with a sign that said "One man, one vote." He said that without freedom of speech and the right to dissent, the civil rights movement would have been a bird without wings. Now you can go back and you could say the same for women's the struggle for women's rights, the ability to petition, to protest, to write pamphlets has been absolutely essential in the right in the struggle for women's rights. And you could say the same for the LGBT movement and so on. So with that, I think that the history shows that in many ways, free speech, the values of free speech and equality are mutually reinforcing. They are not mutually exclusive, and therefore, when we want to safeguard the rights of minorities and historically oppressed groups, free speech is part of the solution rather than the problem. But you might still say, well, yes, free speech has historically been good for and vital to minorities, but now we've reached a stage in history where we have to limit free speech in order to safeguard those rights that free speech helped win. And I think that's an argument that at least has to be taken seriously, and one that is in many ways understandable. But this is where I would argue that history often shows that the cure is worse than the disease. And here I would point to Europe and what I call the Weimar fallacy. So one of the reasons why in all European states various forms of hate speech is criminalized, and in some cases even Holocaust denial and so on, is of course the ethos of never again, which I believe is imperative. This is indeed something that should motivate any European democracy on a continent where so much bloodshed happened. But when we look at the collapse of the Weimar Republic and the rise of Nazism, the story becomes much more complicated. It was actually not the case that the Weimar Republic was a free speech haven that allowed the Nazis a complete free reign. In fact, there was heavy censorship of the radio. Nazis and communists could not speak freely. Adolf Hitler was given a ban against speaking publicly in a number of German states, and a number of laws to protect the Republic provided the government increasingly draconian powers to curb newspapers. So newspapers could be administratively banned for up to a couple of months if they spread false information or attack government officials and so on. And Nazi newspapers were very frequent targets, but they used this cleverly as propaganda to show themselves as sort of martyrs of the state that they attacked. But even more dangerously, a lot of these emergency laws and even emergency provisions in the Weimar Constitution were used by the Nazis when they came into power. So when they came into power, they used an emergency law that allowed banning fake news, for instance, to shut down social democratic newspapers. And the Weimar Constitution was used after the Reichstag was set on fire, and it allowed the president to suspend all civil liberties, and the Nazis pressured the president into do that. And so using the very provisions that were supposed to protect democracy, the Nazis were actually able to destroy democracy through these measures. And to me, this is a clear warning sign of legislating even with the best of intentions and providing these dangerous tools that can be used against democracy itself when they fall into the wrong hand. So, what if free speech is both a good for democracy, for minorities, and so on, and if legislating against criminalizing and prohibiting free speech is not the way forward, what is the way forward? How do we, on the one hand, safeguard free speech and also try to mitigate some of the harms that free speech can do? Well, I think, first of all, we have to come to terms with the fact that free speech does come with harms and costs, and these are not something that you can eliminate completely. So in that sense, free speech has a price, and that and some of the extreme speech and conspiracy theories have been amplified in the digital age, and that is just something that we cannot completely do away with. But we can, for instance, work on a more decentralized social media environment, one where users have more power to determine what kind of content they want to be confronted with. Something so empowering the individual and also groups themselves to moderate the debates that they want to be a part of, but not providing that power to big private tech companies or governments who are likely to abuse them. But I think there's also much to look at when you, for instance, look at the Ukraine conflict. I think that in the West, at least, Russian propaganda has failed miserably. And we see, if you go to Telegram, if you go to Twitter, you see great examples of people coming together, working with open source intelligence to document and debunk Russian propaganda and fake news in real time, documenting war crimes and so on. So I think that having tasted a bit of being subjected to Russian propaganda and active measures has created a higher degree of resilience in democracies, and most importantly among civil society in democracies who have sort of adapted to the threat. And I think that is absolutely key, that civil society is inoculated against these things and fights back through the open means of democracy and free speech. Ultimately, one of the central theses in my book, and when it comes to my thinking on free speech, is really that free speech depends on a culture of free speech. So this is actually a point that has been made by many. It's been made by Frederick Douglass. It's been made by John Stuart Mill, the high priest of liberalism. But my favorite quote on this is really by George Orwell. And he says that the point is that the relative freedom which we enjoy depends on public opinion. If large numbers of people are interested in freedom of speech, there will be freedom of speech even if the law forbids it. If public opinion is sluggish, inconvenient minorities will be persecuted even if laws exist to protect them. And so I think ultimately the future and vitality of free speech depends on each of us and our willingness to uphold this value and really to regard it as something that cannot be taken for granted. Really appreciate how rare a thing it is to live in a country and in a time where you can criticize the powers that be and still go home and see your family and not fear a knock on the door and disappearing into some dungeon and never to be seen or heard from again. This is not something that can be taken for granted, and it has been, free speech has been part of, has been secure only for a very brief part of human history. And so I would hope that all of you will be committed to upholding a flourishing culture of free speech to the benefit of democracy, equality, dignity, and tolerance. And with that, I will look forward to any questions, comments, or criticisms. So thank you very much.
Jakob, thanks very much. That was fantastic. That was such a wonderful survey of the history of free speech and of where we are right now in terms of our relationship with free speech. So we'll move on to the Q&A. We don't have any questions in the Q&A section yet. So audience members, please post your questions there whenever you're ready. I'll start off with a question for you and abuse my position as moderator for a moment. So I want to start off with what I think is a philosophical question about the moral status of free speech in your view. And the question is, do you think free speech is an end in itself, or do you think it's a means of pursuing other ends or values? And the reason that I asked that question is because in Canada, the Supreme Court has adopted this approach of thinking about the justifiability of limits on free speech. In terms of whether the speech in question and the limits in question detract from or further so-called free speech values. So when we think about free speech, should we be thinking about it as an end in itself, or should we be thinking about it as a means to other important ends in a democratic society?
So I've probably become a bit more of a utilitarian when it comes to free speech, where I tended to think more of it as, if not an end in itself, so a very moral case. But I also happen to think that there are a lot of really strong justifications for free speech that are mutually reinforcing rather than mutually exclusive. So I think you can defend free speech on the basis of individual dignity that might, and that defense might be depending on how much emphasis you put on it. You might say that a dignitarian defense of free speech is almost an end where free speech becomes an end in itself. But if you adopt it a dignitarian justification of free speech, I see that as being compatible with one that emphasizes political pluralism, for instance, or the pursuit of truth. I don't think those are mutually exclusive arguments. Whether I would say that it's an end in itself, that might be taking it too far, but I haven't thought about it and that might sound strange, in philosophical terms, to such an extent that I would have be prepared to go as far as saying that defense of free speech is an end in itself. Because I think if you really probe me, then my utilitarian arguments probably have emphasis has been strengthened, even if I think there are other really strong arguments in favor of it as well.
So we've got a few questions in the chat now. I'll start with this one because it came in first. This is a little bit longer, but I'll read it in full. So you seem to focus on free speech serving democratic purposes. However, free speech protections and limits, at least in Canada, are also often justified on the grounds that they serve autonomy/self-realization as well as the pursuit of truth. This actually relates directly to the question I just asked. The debates about protecting and more controversially limiting free speech seem to engage these aspects. First, with democratic purposes serving only a secondary role. In your view, do these other justifications require an element of balancing with the democratic political one? Does the preservation of democracy and freedom sit as the primary consideration?
I don't necessarily see them as being incompatible with each other, because if you said, well, free speech serving democratic purposes, and you're only sort of thinking about the formation of political speech necessary for citizens to form an opinion and vote, and then the majority gets to say to have a say. I think there are free speech serves other purposes in a democracy, and one of them, of course, is to protect minority opinions as well. I mean, in many ways, that is a core function of it, because typically, very often, majorities don't need protection because majorities won't persecute majorities. So I don't necessarily see that conflict, and I think, when it comes to balancing, I'm sure you could find situations where you would say you need some kind of balancing, but I tend, when it comes to viewpoints, for instance, which I'm really concerned about, viewpoint neutrality, for instance, that you should basically be able to give voice to any viewpoint, as long as you don't, for instance, directly incite imminent lawless action. Then I don't really see a balancing test involved there. Yeah, so I don't know if that precisely answers the question, but that's the best I could do.
So here's a short question that probably demands a long answer. How do we fight back against the faceless algorithms of social media companies that work against free speech?
Very good question. So I think, I think there's a lot of tinkering. We're just in the beginning of the digital age, and we tend to think of Facebook and Twitter and YouTube as being sort of natural players, but who's to say that they'll be around, or that they'll be around in the shape and form that they are now? I think there's an incredibly exciting development with more decentralized platforms being developed, where that might not have algorithms are likely to play a role still, but might have less of an impact if you have a more decentralized ecosystem of information in the digital age. But one of the good things about some of the approaches to regulating big tech, if you allow me to use that term, is focus on transparency, which I support. I think it's a good thing with transparency. I don't necessarily think, I think some probably expect too much of transparency. I think algorithmic transparency might be a lot more difficult to figure out. It's not like if you open up a black box that you and I will understand what it means. And they're also likely to change from day to day. But transparency is a first step. So I think that might bring something good with it.
So we've got 5 minutes left, which I think is about time for, let's say, 2 questions. So let me start here. I was curious what your thoughts are on the paradox of tolerance. That being the idea that if we are tolerant of intolerant ideas, our society will eventually be subverted by intolerant actors and become intolerant itself. I see this frequently being raised as an attack on free speech.
Yeah, of course, this is Karl Popper's famous dictum in The Open Society and Its Enemies. But if you read that, there's a footnote to the paradox of tolerance where he sort of qualifies it quite heavily. So he says that something along the lines that he sees that as the absolute exception, that only if you cannot sort of push back through open dialogue, then it's a last resort. But I think my looking as someone who has huge respect for Karl Popper, when I can understand where he comes from. I mean, he's sitting in New Zealand writing this book because he has fled Nazism in Europe. So obviously, I have the luxury of forming my opinions much later from a place of security. Whereas if I had been in the same situation as Karl Popper, I might more easily have adopted his views. But when I look at the history of the Weimar Republic and the rise of Nazism, it was not seemed to me that this the intolerance of intolerance was an effective answer, because it was actually partly carried out. Also, when does intolerance of intolerance itself reach such a degree of intolerance that it must be subjected to intolerance, right? And so it's a very powerful, and you actually see that. So you see it after World War II. The Soviet countries use this argument heavily, both to shape international human rights norms, but also in the countries in Eastern and Central Europe. So in Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, the Allies adopt terms in the peace treaties that oblige these states to ban fascism and to crack down on anti-democratic movements. And what are these provisions used to? They're used to censor and close down all non-communist parties and opinion. So that's another example of the dangers involved with that.
So we have, I think, about 3 questions left in the chat. Unfortunately, I don't think we can get to all of them. I'll go with this one. One of the interesting arguments you've made is that state-based restrictions on expression cross-pollinate internationally. When we extrapolate to the international system as a whole, how do potential restrictors of expression learn and borrow from each other?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I mentioned the German law, and I think, obviously these, Russia, Turkey, and others who have copy-pasted this German law would have adopted and had already adopted censorship measures before. But when democracies sort of create the prototype, if you like, it provides legitimacy and also whataboutery points to these authoritarian regimes, because they can say, well, what's the problem? We have this law, you had it in Germany, and then the Germans can say, yeah, but we have independent courts and we have, fewer categories that we ban, and we have, but you sort of blur the very what I would hope were sort of very bright lines between authoritarian states and democracies when it comes to this. And it's a reversal of another dynamic. So I didn't have time to address this, but one of the Helsinki effect, sort of the Helsinki Final Act, which was adopted in the 70s, where the West sort of tricked Soviet bloc into adopting treaties that mentioned human rights, and that really empowered dissidents to sort of tell their own governments, listen, you've signed these documents that stand where you've guaranteed to protect free speech. So you see Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia with Václav Havel, Lech Walesa in Poland, these Helsinki watch groups sprouting up all over, and free speech and human rights really became a very, very powerful tool that I think played a significant part in toppling communism. And there's a wonderful quote that I might be great finishing with from Václav Havel, when he was in. So he had just been. So he's giving a speech at the U.S. Congress in February 1990. So this is, he's just come out of prison. Communism has fallen, and he says, when they arrested me on October 27, I was living in a country ruled by the most conservative communist government in Europe, and our society slumbered beneath the pall of a totalitarian system. Today, less than 4 months later, I'm speaking to you as the representative of a country that has set out on the road to democracy, a country where there's complete freedom of speech. So I think that really says it all. And at that time, I think democracies were much more aggressive and assertive about free speech. They saw it as a clear competitive advantage against authoritarian states. I think they've lost some of that faith today, and today they don't necessarily see it as a competitive advantage against authoritarian states. They see it as something that can be exploited by authoritarian states to weaken democracies, and I think that's a strategic mistake.
That's a great quote and a great way to end today's session. Unfortunately, we have to end. We're just over time. So a huge thank you again to the late Justice McDonald and his family for making this lecture possible. A huge thank you, of course, to Jakob for giving us such an insightful and thought-provoking lecture and for being so generous with your your time answering questions at the end. A huge thank you to Stephen Penny for representing the Centre's board and for introducing Jakob today. And a huge thank you, as always, to our Public Legal Education Coordinator, Aubrey Abaya, for running today's webinar and for all of your help. So if you enjoyed today's webinar, you can go to constitutionalstudies.ca, our website, for more great content, or you can visit us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, or YouTube. So thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you again, Jakob, and hopefully we'll see you all very soon.